The late afternoon sun slipped through the blinds, cutting stripes of gold across my living room. I had just eased myself onto the couch, propping up my sore knee with a pillow. When the phone rang, the screen flashed with Marjorie's name. My younger sister never called just to talk. "Selena," she said without greeting, her voice brisk and rehearsed. "I need you to watch the baby this weekend. Nate and I have that work retreat in Asheville. We'll be back Sunday night." For a moment, I didn't answer. I could almost hear the expectation in her tone, like the request had already been settled before I picked up. I cleared my throat. "Marjorie, I can't. I have a doctor's appointment Saturday morning. It's a follow-up for my knee." Silence filled the line. I thought maybe she hadn't heard me. Then came her reply, sharp and cold. "Cancel it. The baby comes first." Her words landed like a stone in my chest. Cancel a medical appointment as if my recovery was a hobby I could rearrange at her convenience. I tried to steady my breath. It's not something I can move around. And, honestly, I'm still getting tired easily. I don't think I can manage 2 full days alone with him. There was a pause, then the unmistakable sound of her exhale, heavy with judgment. "Wow. I guess you're just not very supportive of our family." My fingers tightened around the phone. Dozens of responses rushed to the back of my throat, reminders of the bills I'd covered, the nights I'd stayed up rocking her child so she could sleep, the sacrifices I'd made without complaint. But the words stayed locked inside. She ended the call abruptly, leaving only the low hum of silence in my ear. I set the phone down with a trembling hand. For years, I'd been the one she leaned on. Now I sat in my quiet living room, the weight of her words pressing heavier than the ache in my knee, realizing something had shifted that could not be undone. I stared at the phone, knowing this was only the beginning of what she would demand next. After the call ended, I sat there for a long time, staring at the muted glow of the phone screen. Her words echoed in my head, each syllable sharpening into something colder than I wanted to admit. Not supportive, as if years of bending myself into knots had been erased by one "no." I leaned back and let my eyes close. Images unspooled like film reels I hadn't asked to watch. The time Marjorie called me at midnight, frantic because Nate had the flu and she couldn't handle the baby alone. I had driven across town in the rain, stayed up until dawn with a feverish toddler, and still went to work without sleep the next day. Or the year she asked me to cover her portion of our parents' property taxes just until things smoothed out. I never saw that money again. But she bought a new stroller the very next month. There were birthdays I missed with friends because she needed a sitter. Vacations I canceled because she said it was all hands on deck when her second child was born. Each time, I told myself it was what sisters did. That family meant sacrifice. But now, sitting in the quiet of my own living room, I could finally see the pattern. Marjorie's needs had always been urgent, non-negotiable. Mine had been background noise, something she expected me to mute whenever it conflicted with her plans. She didn't ask, she demanded, and I had obliged, year after year. I taught her that my yes was automatic, that my life bent to hers. My knee throbbed beneath the pillow, a steady reminder of what it cost me to keep saying yes. For the first time, the imbalance wasn't just uncomfortable, it was undeniable. I thought I was helping out of love, but maybe, all along, I'd only been training her to take. The realization sank deeper, leaving me unsettled, as if the foundation beneath us had always been cracked and I had only just now noticed. And then, before the weight of it could settle completely, her first message arrived. The first text came barely an hour after our call. "Fine. If you can't be there for us, don't expect us to keep bending for you." I read it twice, my chest tightening with every word. By evening, more messages arrived. "You're selfish." "Always have been." "I guess I just didn't want to see it." Then another family pulls together. "You wouldn't understand." The words were clipped, almost rehearsed, as if she'd been saving them for the first chance to throw at me. The next morning, Aunt Carol left me a voicemail. Her voice was heavy with pity. "Selena, I don't know what happened, but Marjorie told us you refused to help with the baby. Everyone's talking. She said you don't want to be part of the family anymore. I didn't expect this from you." I sat at my kitchen table, gripping the edge until my fingers ached. After all the years of covering for Marjorie's mistakes, I was now the selfish one. I wanted to scream, to catalog every sacrifice like evidence in a trial, but I stayed silent. Silence had always been safer. 2 days later, the real blow came. I stopped by the old house, our parents' house, the one Marjorie still lived in. It was a place I had painted, repaired, and paid taxes on, a place that still smelled faintly of our childhood summers. When I tried the key, it stuck. I jiggled it, pressed harder, but it wouldn't turn. She had changed the locks. For a long moment, I just stood there on the porch, staring at the door I'd once walked through freely, the door that had been ours. The blinds twitched upstairs, a shadow shifting quickly away. My throat burned, not from anger but from the sharp taste of erasure. I stepped back slowly, clutching the useless key, realizing this wasn't just a fight over babysitting. This was Marjorie drawing a line meant to push me out of my own family. And as I drove away, the first tremor of grief gave way to something sharper, something closer to resolve. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, the useless key still heavy in my purse, and thought about every time I had answered her calls without hesitation. The memories piled up faster than I could push them away, until the silence in the house felt unbearable. I rose from bed and went to the hallway closet, the one I hadn't opened in years. On the top shelf sat the old accordion file, its edges frayed from being shuffled too many times. I pulled it down and carried it to the kitchen table. The label in my handwriting read simply, "Family." Inside were neat stacks of paper I had saved out of habit. Not intention. The first page I pulled free was a copy of a check from nearly 10 years ago, $4,000 to cover Nate's hospital bills when his insurance fell short. Beneath that, the receipt for the mortgage payment I had covered when Marjorie and Nate were on the verge of foreclosure. Tucked deeper were notes I'd scribbled on sticky pads, dates I babysat overnight, reminders to pick up their daughter from preschool when work ran late, meal lists I prepared when they both came down with the flu. I kept turning pages, a copy of the wire transfer for the down payment on their house, credit card bills I'd paid when they were between jobs, grocery receipts where the totals always seemed to climb higher when I was the one swiping my card. Line after line, page after page, the record of my sacrifices unfolded in front of me like a ledger written in invisible ink until tonight. My chest tightened as I traced the faded signatures. It wasn't just the money, it was the hours, the missed chances, the way I'd reshaped my life to fit around theirs. For years, I had told myself this was what family did. But as I stared at the piles, the question rose like a whisper I couldn't silence. Who has ever taken care of me? The grief came first, raw and sharp, but beneath it a steadier current moved. It wasn't rage exactly, more like the first steady breath after holding it too long. I stacked the papers back into the file, pressed the edges closed, and knew the time for silence was over. In the morning, I called Mr. Whitfield's office and asked for an appointment. Mr. Whitfield's office smelled faintly of leather and old paper, the kind of place where decisions carried weight. He had been my parents' attorney before me, a man who never rushed his words and never treated me like I was naive. When he welcomed me into the small conference room, I felt the steadiness of his presence before we'd even sat down. "I need to make some changes," I said, sliding the worn folder onto the table. My voice was even, but my hands trembled slightly against the polished wood. "Financial. Legal. I can't keep things the way they are." He nodded, as if he had been expecting this moment for years. "Tell me where you'd like to begin." I started with the practical. The shared accounts Marjorie had partial access to needed to be closed. The recurring transfers to her household, Cancelled immediately. Mr. Whitfield listened without interruption, jotting neat notes in his narrow script, only pausing to ask for dates or account numbers. Each time he wrote something down, the air in my lungs felt clearer, as though I was reclaiming pieces of myself line by line. Then came the harder part. My will, I said quietly. The words felt heavy, but not frightening. I want to redirect my assets. Everything I'd planned to leave to Marjorie and her children, I'd like to designate instead to Clara Benton. His brows lifted slightly, but there was no judgment in his eyes. Your friend? Yes, I said. She's been there without asking anything in return. That matters more to me than blood at this point. For the first time in weeks, a calm settled in my chest. It wasn't revenge I was carving into these documents. It was dignity. By the time I signed the preliminary forms, my hand ached, but my heart felt steady. Mr. Whitfield gathered the papers, stacking them neatly. We'll finalize everything next week. You've taken the first step. I left his office with the sunlight sharp on my face, carrying no apologies and no guilt, only the certainty that something in me had shifted for good. By the time I returned home, Marjorie's name was already lighting up my phone. The first call came just after dinner. My phone rattled against the counter. Marjorie's name flashing. I let it go to voicemail, but she called again and again, until I finally answered. What the hell is this? She shouted before I could speak. The transfer didn't come through, and the credit card declined. Do you think this is funny? Her voice cracked with fury, sharp enough to make me hold the phone away from my ear. I steadied myself. It's not a mistake. I stopped the payments. There was silence for a beat, then an explosion. You can't just do that. You know what we rely on. You've always helped us. You don't get to pull the rug out now. I do, I said softly, though my heart was pounding. I've done enough. More than enough. She scoffed, the sound bitter. So this is who you really are. Petty. Ungrateful. After everything I've let you be part of our family. Our kids, you cut us off over some ridiculous appointment. You're unbelievable. The words stung, but something inside me held firm. I'm your sister, Marjorie, not your servant. You'll figure out your bills. You always do. She hung up with a sharp click. A moment later, the messages started long paragraphs of accusation, fragments of rage, a parade of blame. By morning, my aunt called again, pleading that I be the bigger person. Another cousin left a message, saying Marjorie was in tears, that I'd gone too far. I sat at my kitchen table, phone buzzing endlessly beside my teacup. For years, those voices would have been enough to drive me back, to make me apologize for boundaries I never should have had to defend. But now, I felt only a thin, steady calm. They didn't know the half of what I'd given, and maybe they didn't care to. I turned the phone face down and whispered the truth aloud. If only for myself, I am her sister, not her servant. The words settled into me like a promise, stronger than any apology I could have offered. By the time evening came, the storm of calls hadn't slowed, but I noticed something surprising I no longer felt the need to pick up, and that was when her next message arrived, laced not with rage, but with something else entirely. The message blinked on my screen just before midnight. Unlike the others, it wasn't blistering with rage. I'm sorry. It read, I lost my temper. I shouldn't have said those things. Can we start over? I stared at the words, half expecting them to dissolve. After days of venom, they looked out of place, almost gentle. A second message followed. We really need you. Selena, just this once. Please help us out, and I promise things will be different. For a moment. My chest ached. This was the voice I'd been waiting for all my life, contrition, even if brief. My fingers hovered above the keyboard, temptation pulling at me. What if I was wrong? What if this was the moment she finally realized how far she'd gone the next morning? I almost convinced myself to call her back, but when I walked out to the mailbox, the truth landed harder than any apology could. Among the usual envelopes was one from the county clerk's office, addressed to both of us as heirs. My stomach tightened as I slid it open. Inside were copies of documents Marjorie had filed quietly, without a word to me petitioning for sole control of our parents' estate. She'd argued I was no longer involved with the family and therefore unfit to co-manage the property. The words blurred as I read them, my hands trembling. The apology, the plea for help. It hadn't been about healing. It had been about securing what she wanted without interference. I folded the papers carefully and set them on the table. The silence around me sharp and absolute. For years I had doubted myself, second-guessed every instinct, convinced her needs outweighed my own. But here was proof in black ink that her tears were tools, her words weapons. I slid the documents back into their envelope and felt something inside me lock into place. Whatever she thought she could take from me, it would no longer include my trust. That evening, I picked up the phone not to call her, but to dial Clara instead. Clara showed up on my doorstep the next afternoon with a grocery bag hanging from one arm. "I brought soup," she said simply, brushing past me like she'd been doing it all her life. The familiar scent of garlic and thyme followed her into the kitchen. I hadn't planned on telling her everything, but the words tumbled out as I set bowls on the table. I told her about the calls, the texts, the locks changed, the apology that wasn't, and finally the papers from the clerk's office. She listened without flinching, her sharp green eyes never leaving mine. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, arms folded. "Selena, I've known you since college. You've spent half your life holding other people up. But when do you let someone hold you?" The question lodged in my throat. I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came. Clara reached across the table, her hand firm and warm on mine. "You deserve respect, not guilt, not manipulation. Respect." Her certainty steadied me more than I wanted to admit. For years, I'd been drowning in the noise of Marjorie's demands. And now, here was Clara, offering silence, space, and something that felt dangerously like peace. "You know," she added lightly, "if you ever need to get out for a while, my guest room's always open. Fresh sheets, window that looks out on the garden, no one banging on your door demanding you cancel your life." The offer hit me harder than any accusation Marjorie had hurled. I hadn't realized how badly I needed to hear it that I had somewhere else to land. Someone else who saw me not for what I gave, but for who I was. I gripped her hand, the edges of my resolve softening into gratitude. Family, I realized, wasn't always about blood. Sometimes it was about the people who showed up, soup in hand, without asking for anything in return. When Clara left that evening, the house didn't feel empty. It felt steadier, as if her presence had left behind a promise I could finally believe in, and it was that steadiness I carried into the night, until the knock came at my door. The knock turned into pounding before I reached the door. When I opened it, Marjorie stood on the porch, her face flushed, hair disheveled, a storm ready to break. She pushed past me without asking, the baby balanced on her hip, fussing from the commotion. "You're destroying this family," she spat, her voice sharp enough to rattle the air. "He misses you. He cries at night. Do you even care you're abandoning us?" I steadied myself, watching her pace the room as if anger alone could force me back into place. "I care," I said quietly. "But caring doesn't mean being used." Her head snapped toward me. "Used. After everything we've given you, our trust, our children." I cut her off before she could twist the story any further. "I'm not free childcare. Marjorie, I'm your sister." The words hung between us like a line drawn across the floor. For once, I didn't rush to soften them. I let the silence do its work. She blinked, caught off guard, then pressed harder. "You think you're better than me? Fine. Keep your money, keep your pity, but don't come crawling back when you realize you need us." I didn't flinch. The baby whimpered, and she adjusted him awkwardly, her bravado faltering in the smallest crack. I saw then what I'd missed for years, not strength, but desperation. Her entire world balanced on the assumption I would always bend. "I won't argue with you anymore," I said, voice steady. "You've made your choices, and I've made mine." She glared at me, but for the first time. Her words seemed to stumble before reaching my ears. She shifted the baby on her hip and marched toward the door, slamming it behind her. The silence that followed didn't feel empty. It felt mine, and in that stillness, I knew exactly what had to come next. The days after Marjorie's visit stretched quiet and clean, like the air after a storm. I woke early, brewed tea, and sat by the window without waiting for a phone to ring or a demand to arrive. My knee ached less now that I wasn't running at someone else's pace. I had time to rest, time to heal, time that belonged to me. Clara stopped by often, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with nothing but conversation. We talked about books, gardens, the small things that filled ordinary days with meaning. For the first time in years, I felt seen without having to prove my worth. Her presence reminded me that love didn't always have to come with conditions. I still thought of my nephew, his laugh, the way his small hand had curled around mine. I loved him, and I always would, but I understood now that love for him didn't require sacrificing myself to Marjorie's demands. If she chose to keep me at arm's length, that was her decision. I no longer needed to buy my place in their lives. Evenings became mine again. I read books I had abandoned on the shelf, called old friends I hadn't spoken to in years, and let silence sit comfortably in my home. Each choice I made was a stitch pulling me back together. I didn't regret the boundary I'd drawn. It wasn't vengeance, it was survival. And more than that, it was peace. Blood might tie us, but it had never guaranteed kindness. Respect was what made family, and respect was what I finally chose for myself. As I sat on the porch one evening, the sky streaked with fading light, I found myself wondering if respect defines family. Who would truly remain in yours?